Thomas Wright sat in his own living room, surrounded by his wife's family, and listened to them discuss his future, as if he weren't there. His mother-in-law, Patricia, was holding court from the armchair he'd bought 3 years ago. His brother-in-law, Derek, was pacing near the window overlooking the lake, the view Thomas had fallen in love with when he'd purchased this property, and his wife, Melissa, sat on the couch with her sister, Lauren, both of them nodding along as Patricia laid out her plan for Thomas's departure. "The way I see it, Thomas, you've had a good run here," Patricia said, her tone suggesting she was doing him a favor by even having this conversation. "But let's be realistic about the situation. This marriage isn't working, and Melissa deserves to stay in her family home with people who actually support her. You can find an apartment somewhere. Start fresh. We'll give you until the end of the month to pack up and get out." Thomas said nothing, just took a sip of his coffee and watched his wife avoid his eyes. Melissa had been pulling away for months now, influenced by her family's constant interference in their marriage. But this was a new level of audacity, even for the Morrison clan. "Did you hear me, Thomas?" Patricia's voice sharpened. "End of the month. That gives you 2 weeks to find a place and move your things out. Melissa will stay here, obviously. This is her house." That's when Thomas finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Actually, Patricia, this is my house. My name is on the deed. I pay the mortgage. I've paid every single bill for this property since I bought it 6 years ago. So no, I won't be moving out. But I'm very interested to hear more about your plan to throw me out of my own home." The silence that followed was absolute. Patricia's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then an ugly shade of red as she processed what Thomas had just said. Derek stopped pacing and stared at him. Lauren's mouth literally fell open, and Melissa looked at her husband with an expression that suggested she'd never actually considered who owned the house they'd been living in for the past 4 years of their marriage. What the Morrison family didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about because they'd made assumptions based on their own narrative, was that Thomas Wright wasn't some struggling nobody who'd gotten lucky marrying into their family. He was a successful commercial real estate investor who'd built a portfolio worth over $8 million, and the lakefront house they were trying to evict him from was entirely his property, purchased with his money, maintained with his income, and titled exclusively in his name. Over the next few weeks, the Morrison family was going to learn a very expensive lesson about the dangers of assumptions, the importance of knowing basic facts before making demands, and the difference between confidence and actual power. Thomas Wright had met Melissa Morrison 5 years ago at a charity fundraiser in Portland. She'd been beautiful, charming, working as an event coordinator for a non-profit, and seemingly independent. Thomas had been immediately attracted to her warmth and energy, and Melissa had seemed drawn to his quiet confidence and stability. Their courtship had been relatively brief, 8 months from first date to engagement. Thomas had been 34, ready to settle down after years of building his career. Melissa had been 29, talking about wanting to start a family and build a life with someone stable and caring. On the surface, they'd seemed compatible. The problems had started almost immediately after the wedding, but they'd been subtle at first. Melissa's family, particularly her mother Patricia and her older brother Derek, had strong opinions about everything in Melissa's life, and they weren't shy about sharing those opinions. Where Melissa and Thomas should live, how they should spend money, what kind of car Melissa should drive, whether they should have children right away. All of it was subject to Morrison family commentary and interference. Thomas had tried to be understanding. Melissa came from a close family, and he'd grown up with distant, uninvolved parents. So he'd initially seen the Morrison clan's involvement as something positive, a sign of family bonds he'd never experienced. But close quickly became suffocating, and involved quickly became controlling. Patricia Morrison was the matriarch, a woman in her late 50s who'd raised 4 children and now saw her adult children's lives as extensions of her own authority. She'd been married to a successful attorney until his death 7 years ago, and she carried herself with the air of someone accustomed to having her opinions treated as facts. Derek was the oldest, a middle management executive at a regional bank who'd never quite achieved the success he thought he deserved, and compensated by being aggressively involved in his siblings' lives. Lauren was 2 years older than Melissa, married to a doctor, and constantly competing with her younger sister in ways both subtle and overt. The youngest was Brian, who'd moved to California and wisely maintained significant distance from the family drama. The Morrison family had always had money, not wealthy exactly, but comfortable upper-middle-class money that came with certain expectations and sense of entitlement. Patricia's late husband had provided well for the family, and Patricia herself had inherited money from her own parents. The family lived in a nice neighborhood, drove nice cars, and carried themselves with the confidence of people who'd never had to struggle. When Melissa had introduced Thomas to her family, they'd made immediate assumptions about who he was and what he brought to the relationship. Thomas was quiet, unassuming, dressed casually, and worked in real estate, which they'd assumed meant he was a realtor, or maybe a property manager. Nothing impressive, in other words, but stable enough to provide for Melissa. What they'd never bothered to ask, what Melissa herself had never fully understood, was that Thomas wasn't a realtor. He was a real estate investor who owned a portfolio of commercial properties across Oregon and Washington. He'd started investing in his mid-20s with money he'd saved working construction, buying his first small retail building when he was 26. He'd renovated it, increased its value, refinanced it to pull out equity, and used that equity to buy 2 more properties. Over the next 8 years, Thomas had built that single property into a portfolio of 17 commercial buildings, retail spaces, small office buildings, and a couple of mixed-use developments. His properties generated about $40,000 per month in net rental income, and his portfolio's total value was approximately $8 million. He managed the properties himself with help from a small team, keeping overhead low and profits high. Thomas lived modestly, despite his wealth. He drove a 5-year-old pickup truck, wore jeans and work shirts most days, and avoided flashy displays of money. He'd bought the lakefront house 3 years before meeting Melissa because he'd wanted a peaceful place to live, somewhere beautiful where he could relax after dealing with tenants and contractors. He'd paid $600,000 cash for the property. No mortgage, no debt. When Thomas and Melissa had gotten engaged, he'd tried to have conversations about finances, about his business, about the house, but Melissa had always waved off those conversations as boring details that could wait. She was in love, planning a wedding, focused on the romance rather than the practical realities of building a life together. "We'll figure all that stuff out later," Melissa had said, whenever Thomas tried to discuss finances. "I trust you. You've got a good job. You're responsible. That's what matters." Thomas had let it drop, partly because he'd been in love, and partly because he'd been curious to see if Melissa would love him for who he was, rather than what he had. He'd seen too many relationships where money changed everything, and he'd wanted to build something real with Melissa before wealth became part of the equation. They'd married in a medium-sized wedding that Thomas had paid for, $30,000 for an event at a nice vineyard outside Portland. The Morrison family had contributed nothing financially, but had taken credit for helping plan the perfect wedding for their daughter. After the wedding, Thomas and Melissa had moved into the lakefront house. Melissa had seemed thrilled with the house, telling her family about the beautiful views and spacious rooms, but she'd never asked how Thomas had afforded it, never questioned why there was no mortgage payment, never seemed curious about the details of his work beyond knowing he dealt with properties. The Morrison family had made their own assumptions. Patricia had decided Thomas was a property manager who'd gotten lucky with a nice rental house from a generous landlord. Derek had assumed Thomas was living above his means, probably mortgaged to the hilt. Lauren had cattily commented that Melissa's house was nice, even if it's probably not actually theirs. No one had asked Thomas directly about any of this, because they'd already decided he was unremarkable. A nice enough guy, certainly stable and responsible, but not someone particularly successful or impressive. Just a working-class guy who'd married into a family that was slightly above his station. The first year of marriage had been rocky, but manageable. Melissa wanted her family involved in everything. They had keys to the house, would drop by unannounced, would call daily and expect Melissa to share every detail of her life. Thomas had tried to set boundaries, but Melissa had accused him of being controlling and trying to separate her from her family. They're just being supportive, Melissa would say when Thomas complained about Patricia rearranging their kitchen, or Derek offering unsolicited advice about their finances. That's what families do. The second year had been worse. Melissa's family had become openly critical of Thomas. He didn't make enough money, in their view. He should be doing more to provide for Melissa, should be looking at bigger houses, better cars, more impressive displays of success. The fact that Melissa was still working, she'd gone back to event planning after taking a year off after the wedding, was seen as Thomas's failure to provide adequately. Melissa shouldn't have to work if she doesn't want to, Patricia had said multiple times. A husband should be able to provide a lifestyle where his wife has choices. Thomas had bitten his tongue during these comments, but they'd stung. Melissa made $40,000 a year planning events. Thomas made over $400,000 a year from his rental properties. Melissa could have stopped working any time she wanted. Thomas had told her as much. But she enjoyed her work and wanted to maintain her independence. The Morrison family saw it differently. They saw a husband failing to provide adequately, forcing their daughter to work. The third year of marriage had brought increasing conflict. Thomas had tried multiple times to have honest conversations with Melissa about finances, about his actual income and assets, about the future. But Melissa had become defensive, accusing him of being obsessed with money or trying to make her feel bad about her own income. "I don't care how much money you make," Melissa had said during one argument. "I married you for who you are, not your bank account." "I know that," Thomas had replied, "but I want you to actually understand our financial situation. Your family thinks I'm not providing for you, and it's causing problems. If they knew the truth, I don't want to talk about money with my family. It's tacky. They don't need to know our private business." So the Morrison family had continued operating on their assumptions, and those assumptions had shaped their treatment of Thomas. They'd become increasingly disrespectful, treating him as a disappointing appendage to their beloved Melissa, rather than as her equal partner. Derek had started making comments about Thomas needing to step up and find a better job. Patricia had suggested multiple times that Melissa could do better if she wanted to. Lauren had made snide remarks about how her doctor husband provided so much better than Melissa's property manager husband. The breaking point had come 3 months ago, when Melissa had told Thomas she thought they should separate. She'd been crying, conflicted, clearly torn between her marriage and her family's constant pressure. The Morrison clan had been telling her for months that she deserved better, that Thomas was holding her back, that she could find someone more successful and impressive if she just had the courage to leave. "I love you," Melissa had said through tears, "but my family thinks this isn't working. They think you're not ambitious enough, not successful enough. They think I'm settling." "And what do you think?" Thomas had asked quietly. "I don't know anymore. They're my family, Thomas. I trust their judgment. And when I look at our life, at how we're living, I wonder if they're right. I wonder if I could have more, could have better. You could have anything you want, Melissa, but you've never bothered to ask what's actually possible." "What does that mean?" "It means your family has convinced you that I'm unsuccessful based on complete ignorance of our actual financial situation. It means you've let them judge me without ever defending me or correcting their assumptions. It means you value their opinion more than our marriage. The conversation had ended badly, with Melissa accusing Thomas of attacking her family, and Thomas realizing that his wife might never choose him over her mother and siblings. They'd been living in tense limbo since then, with talk of separation hanging over them, but no actual action taken. Until today, when Patricia had decided to take matters into her own hands and informed Thomas that he needed to move out of Melissa's house by the end of the month. The silence in the living room stretched out after Thomas's revelation that he actually owned the house. Patricia recovered first, her face hardening into the expression she used when someone dared to challenge her authority. "That can't be right," Patricia said firmly. "This house is too expensive for someone in your position to afford." "Melissa said you work in property management. How would you have bought a house like this?" "I didn't say I work in property management," Thomas replied calmly. "Melissa assumed that. I said I work in real estate. I own commercial properties, 17 of them to be precise, with a total value of approximately $8 million. I bought this house 6 years ago for $600,000. Cash, no mortgage. I've paid every expense associated with this property since I purchased it. So when I say it's my house, Patricia, I mean it's legally, financially, and in every other way my house." Derek stepped forward, his face flushed with anger or embarrassment. Thomas couldn't tell which. "If you're so wealthy, why have you been letting everyone think you're just some working-class guy? Why didn't you tell us?" "I tried to have financial conversations with Melissa multiple times. She didn't want to discuss it, and none of you ever asked. You made assumptions based on how I dress and the fact that I work with my hands sometimes. You decided I was unremarkable and treated me accordingly. That's your failure, not mine." "This is ridiculous," Lauren interjected. "If you really own all these properties and make all this money, why does Melissa still have to work? Why are you making her struggle while you sit on millions of dollars?" Thomas turned his attention to Lauren, his patience finally wearing thin. "Melissa works because she wants to work. I've told her multiple times that she doesn't need to, that she can pursue whatever makes her happy. She chooses to continue event planning because she enjoys it. Your family has interpreted her working as me failing to provide, when the reality is that I've given her complete freedom to choose. She's not struggling, Lauren. She's choosing." "I don't believe you," Patricia said flatly. "Show us proof. Show us these properties you supposedly own, these millions of dollars you supposedly have. Because right now, this sounds like desperate lies from a man trying to save his marriage." Thomas pulled out his phone and opened his property management software. "These are my 17 properties. Here are the current leases, the rental income, the expenses. Here's the property deed for this house, showing my name as sole owner. Here are my bank statements showing rental income deposits. Would you like to see my tax returns? Because I'm happy to show you exactly how much income I've reported to the IRS for the last 5 years." He held out the phone, and Patricia reluctantly took it, scrolling through the information with increasingly wide eyes. Derek looked over her shoulder, his expression shifting from skepticism to shock. Lauren grabbed the phone next, her face going pale as she verified what Thomas was showing them. "This is real?" Melissa's voice was small, almost childlike. "You actually own all this? You've had this much money the whole time we've been married? Multiple times. You didn't want to discuss finances. You said it was boring, that you trusted me to handle it. So I handled it. I paid all our major expenses, saved and invested the rest, and let you use your income for whatever you wanted. You've never been responsible for the mortgage, because there is no mortgage. You've never had to worry about property taxes or insurance or utilities, because I pay all of it. Your entire salary has been yours to spend or save as you choose." "Why didn't you tell my family?" Melissa asked, tears starting to fall. "Why did you let them think you were just a property manager or whatever?" "I didn't let them think anything. They made assumptions without asking questions. And Melissa, every time they criticized me or suggested you deserved better, you didn't defend me. You didn't correct them. You let them believe I was inadequate because some part of you agreed with them. Patricia set the phone down with shaking hands, and for the first time since Thomas had known her, she looked genuinely rattled. This changes things, does it? Thomas asked quietly. 5 minutes ago, you were ordering me out of what you thought was Melissa's house. You were comfortable throwing me out when you thought I was nobody. Now that you know I have money, suddenly things change? That tells me everything I need to know about your values, Patricia. That's not fair. Melissa stood up, her voice rising. We didn't know. You deliberately kept this from us. I kept it private. There's a difference. I'm not required to broadcast my financial situation to my in-laws. But Melissa, you're my wife. You should have known. You should have been curious enough about our life, our finances, our future, to ask basic questions. The fact that you weren't tells me that you didn't really want to know who I was. You were content with your family's narrative that I was mediocre. Derek found his voice again, trying to recover some control of the situation. Look, obviously there's been a misunderstanding here. Maybe we all jumped to conclusions, but that doesn't change the fact that this marriage isn't working. Melissa's unhappy, you're clearly unhappy. Maybe it's time to discuss separation in a more civil way. Civil? Thomas couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped. You mean now that you know I own assets worth millions, you want to be civil? You want to discuss separation in a way that might get Melissa a better settlement? That's what this is really about, isn't it? 5 minutes ago, you were comfortable throwing me out with nothing. Now you want to negotiate. That's a terrible thing to say, Patricia snapped, recovering some of her usual authority. We're trying to look out for our daughter's interests. That's what families do. No, Patricia. What families do is support their children's marriages, not undermine them. What families do is give their children the benefit of the doubt, not constantly criticize their spouses. You've spent 4 years convincing Melissa that she married beneath her station without knowing a single fact about our actual situation. That's not looking out for her interests. That's projecting your own values and assumptions onto her life. The room fell silent again, the tension thick enough to cut. Melissa was crying openly now. Lauren looked uncomfortable. Derek was red-faced and angry, and Patricia seemed to be calculating her next move. Thomas stood up, suddenly exhausted by the whole situation. I think you all need to leave now. This is my house, and I want you out of it. You can't throw us out, Derek protested. Melissa lives here. Melissa lives here because she's my wife. The rest of you are here because I've tolerated your constant intrusion into our marriage. But that tolerance ends today. Get out of my house. Melissa? Patricia looked at her daughter expectantly, clearly waiting for Melissa to defend her family, to push back against Thomas's demand. But Melissa just sat there, tears streaming down her face, looking lost and confused. She'd built her entire understanding of her marriage on her family's narrative, and that narrative had just been revealed as completely false. She didn't know what to do with that information, how to process it, how to reconcile who she'd believed Thomas was with who he actually was. Melissa, I asked you a question a minute ago, and you never answered it. Thomas said gently. What do you think? Not what your family thinks. Not what they've told you to think. What do you actually think about our marriage? I don't know anymore, Melissa whispered. I thought I knew who you were. I thought I understood our life. But I don't. I don't know you at all. You could have known me if you'd been interested enough to ask. You chose not to be curious about my work, about our finances, about the practical realities of our life together. That was your choice, Melissa, not mine. Patricia stood up, gathering her dignity around her like armor. Come on, Melissa. Let's go. You don't have to stay here and listen to this. Actually, she does have to stay here, Thomas corrected, unless she's decided she wants to move out. This is where she lives. You're the ones who need to leave. Melissa, come with us. Patricia commanded. We'll figure this out as a family. And that was the moment of truth. Melissa looked at her mother, then at Thomas. And Thomas could see the decision forming. Would she choose her husband, or would she choose her family? Would she stay and try to rebuild a marriage that had been poisoned by outside interference? Or would she leave with her family and continue letting them make decisions for her? Melissa stood up, wiping her eyes. I need some time to think. I'm going to stay with Mom for a few days while I figure things out. Thomas felt something break inside his chest, but he kept his voice steady. If you leave now with them, after everything that just happened, I don't think you'll be coming back. That's manipulative, Derek shouted. You can't threaten her like that. I'm not threatening her. I'm telling her the truth. If she chooses her family over our marriage right now, in this moment, when they've just tried to throw me out of my own house, based on completely wrong assumptions, then we don't have a marriage worth saving. Melissa gets to make that choice, but she needs to understand what she's choosing. Melissa grabbed her purse, her movements jerky and uncertain. I just need time, Thomas. I can't think clearly right now. Time away from me with the people who've been poisoning your opinion of me for 4 years. That's not time to think, Melissa. That's time for them to convince you that somehow I'm the bad guy in this situation. But Melissa was already walking toward the door, her family clustering around her protectively. Patricia shot Thomas a look of pure venom as she ushered her daughter out. Derek paused at the door long enough to say, You'll be hearing from our lawyer, before following his family out. Lauren was the last to leave. She paused and looked at Thomas with something that might have been apology or regret. For what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad guy. I think we all misjudged you. But Melissa's my sister. I have to support her, even when she's wrong, especially then. That's what family does. And Thomas was alone in his house, the house Patricia had tried to throw him out of, the house Melissa had never realized was entirely his, the house that suddenly felt very large and very empty. Thomas called his attorney the next morning. Her name was Rebecca Thornton, the same attorney who'd helped his friend Michael through a difficult divorce. Rebecca listened to the whole story without interrupting, making notes as Thomas detailed the Morrison family's attempted eviction and Melissa's decision to leave with them. This is actually more straightforward than you might think, Rebecca said when he'd finished. The house is your separate property, purchased before marriage with your separate funds. Melissa has no claim to it. Your rental properties are also your separate assets. Washington's community property laws mean Melissa is entitled to half of income and assets accumulated during the marriage, but not to separate property you brought into the marriage. What does that mean in practical terms? It means Melissa will get half of joint accounts and half of any income from your properties that was earned during the marriage and not spent. But she doesn't get the properties themselves, and she doesn't get the house. If she's consulted an attorney, which it sounds like her family is pushing her to do, she's probably getting advice right now that she should stay in the house to establish residence and claim a right to remain there. The fact that she left works in your favor. Her brother threatened me with lawyers. Of course he did. But threats aren't legal arguments. What matters is what assets are separate property versus community property. From what you've told me, you brought substantial separate assets into this marriage and kept them separate. That protects you significantly. I don't want to destroy Melissa financially. I just want her to understand reality. Reality is that she'll receive a fair settlement based on Washington law, but that settlement will be much smaller than her family probably assumes. If she'd stayed in the marriage, she'd have continued benefiting from your income and your assets. By leaving, she's choosing a settlement over a partnership. That's her right, but she should understand what she's choosing. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation unfolded exactly as Rebecca had predicted. Melissa, influenced by her family and a lawyer Derek had recommended, filed for divorce and requested temporary spousal support, half of all marital assets, and the right to remain in the marital home during divorce proceedings. Thomas's response, prepared by Rebecca, was a detailed accounting of his separate property. The house, purchased 3 years before marriage, the 17 commercial properties, all purchased before marriage, his business accounts and management company, established before marriage, and documentation showing that Melissa had contributed virtually nothing to these assets during the marriage. The only community property was income earned from his properties during the marriage that hadn't been spent, totaling about $400,000, which Thomas agreed to split 50-50. He offered Melissa $200,000 as her share of community property and agreed to pay limited spousal support of $2,000 per month for 2 years to help her transition to single life. When Melissa's attorney received this offer, Thomas later learned there had been an explosive meeting at the Morrison family home. Melissa and her family had been expecting a multi-million-dollar settlement. They'd been confident that Melissa would get half of Thomas's $8 million property portfolio, half the value of the house, ongoing substantial alimony for years. Instead, she was being offered $200,000 and 2 years of modest support. The house would remain Thomas's. The properties would remain Thomas's. Everything Melissa had been living with for 4 years would stay with Thomas, because it had always been his. Derek called Thomas directly, violating the attorney protocol, his voice shaking with rage. "This offer is insulting. Melissa was your wife for 4 years. She's entitled to more than a measly $200,000. She's entitled to exactly what Washington law says she's entitled to," Thomas replied calmly. "Half of community property accumulated during marriage. She didn't contribute to my separate assets, didn't help purchase or manage my properties, didn't even know they existed until 2 weeks ago. She gets what's fair under the law. She gave you 4 years of her life, and I gave her 4 years of mine. Plus I provided a lifestyle she could never have afforded on her own, paid all our major expenses, and allowed her to keep her entire salary for personal use. I didn't owe her ignorance about our finances, Derek. She chose not to know, and that choice is on her, not me. You're a cold bastard, you know that? I'm a man who built something substantial before marriage and protected it legally during marriage. If Melissa had stayed, she'd have continued benefiting from everything I built. She chose to leave. That's her right. But she doesn't get to leave and take what I built before I even met her. That's not cold. That's just reality." Derek hung up on him. But the pattern was set. The Morrison family had expected Thomas to be a pushover, someone they could manipulate or intimidate into a generous settlement out of guilt or social pressure. Instead, they were discovering that Thomas had excellent legal counsel, had maintained his assets properly throughout the marriage, and had no intention of giving away his life's work because Melissa's family had pressured her into divorce. The next contact came from Patricia, who showed up at the house unannounced. One evening, Thomas almost didn't let her in, but curiosity won out. "I came to appeal to your sense of decency," Patricia began. Standing in the foyer of the house she'd tried to evict him from 2 weeks earlier. "Melissa is devastated. She's staying in my guest room, crying every night, wondering how things went so wrong so fast." "They went wrong because you convinced her I was worthless without knowing any facts about who I actually am," Thomas replied. "You spent 4 years undermining our marriage because I didn't meet your definition of success. Now she's discovering that your definition was based on complete ignorance, and she doesn't know how to process that." "We made mistakes," Patricia admitted, "and the acknowledgement seemed to cost her. We judged you unfairly. But that doesn't mean Melissa should suffer financially because of our errors in judgment. Melissa isn't suffering. She's receiving exactly what the law says she's entitled to." The fact that it's less than you expected doesn't make it unfair. $200,000 won't buy a house. It won't provide security for her future. She has a job that pays $40,000 a year. She has skills and education. She's perfectly capable of supporting herself. The fact that she got used to living in a $600,000 house and benefiting from my income doesn't mean she's entitled to continue that lifestyle after divorce. She chose to end the marriage, Patricia. Choices have consequences. You're punishing her for listening to her family. I'm not punishing her at all. I'm simply not rewarding her for ending our marriage based on her family's ignorant assumptions. There's a difference. Patricia's face hardened, the brief vulnerability disappearing. You're not the man I thought you were. Finally, something we agree on. I'm not the man you thought I was. The question is why you thought that, Patricia. Why did you make such confident judgments without any factual basis? Why did you feel entitled to interfere in our marriage when you didn't even know basic facts about our life? That's your character flaw, not mine. Patricia left without another word, and Thomas knew that would be the last time any of the Morrisons tried to appeal to him directly. From here on out, everything would go through attorneys, and the divorce would proceed according to law rather than emotion or family manipulation. The divorce was finalized. 4 months later, Melissa received her settlement of $200,000 plus 24 months of spousal support. Thomas kept his house, his properties, his business, and his peace of mind. The Morrison family was furious, convinced that Thomas had somehow cheated Melissa out of what she deserved, unable to accept that their assumptions and interference had cost their daughter a marriage that would have provided her with security and partnership if they'd just left it alone. Thomas heard through mutual friends that Melissa had moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment and was struggling to adjust to living on her salary alone after years of benefiting from Thomas's income without realizing it. She told friends she felt betrayed, that Thomas had deliberately hidden his wealth to trick her. The narrative the Morrison family constructed was that Thomas was a manipulative liar who deceived poor Melissa for years. But the people who actually knew Thomas, his business associates, his tenants, his real friends, knew better. Thomas had been exactly who he'd always been. He tried to have honest conversations about finances with his wife, and she'd repeatedly shut them down. He'd lived authentically, worked hard, and built something valuable. The fact that Melissa and her family had made wrong assumptions said everything about them and nothing about him. 6 months after the divorce, Thomas ran into Melissa at a restaurant. She was there with a girlfriend, and Thomas was having dinner with a business associate. They acknowledged each other with awkward nods, but as Thomas was leaving, Melissa caught him near the door. "Can we talk for a minute?" she asked, her voice soft and uncertain. Thomas glanced at his associate, who waved him off and headed to the car. Thomas followed Melissa to a quiet corner of the restaurant's lobby. "I wanted to apologize," Melissa said, her eyes downcast. "I've had time to think, to understand what really happened. You tried to tell me about your business, about the house, about everything. I didn't want to listen. I let my family convince me you weren't good enough, without ever actually knowing who you were." "I appreciate the apology," Thomas said carefully. "But Melissa, the problem wasn't just that you didn't know. It's that you didn't care to know. In 4 years of marriage, you never asked substantive questions about my work, never wanted to see tax returns or financial statements, never showed curiosity about how we afforded our lifestyle. You weren't interested in knowing me beyond the surface. I know. I realize that now. I was shallow and lazy, and I let other people's opinions matter more than my own judgment." She looked up at him, tears threatening. "Do you think there's any chance we could try again? I understand now what I had. What I threw away, I'd do things differently." Thomas felt sadness wash over him, but not regret. "You understand now, because you know about my money. But Melissa, I'm the same person I was when your family was trying to throw me out of my own house. The same person I was when you left with them instead of staying to work on our marriage. The only thing that changed is your knowledge of my bank account, and that's exactly the problem. It is, though. If I was actually just a property manager making $40,000 a year, would you want to get back together? Would you have apologized, or would you still believe your family was right, that you deserved better? Melissa's silence was answer enough. That's what I thought, Thomas said gently. I hope you find happiness, Melissa. I hope you find someone your family approves of and who meets their definition of success. But I hope even more that you learn to think for yourself, to ask questions, to actually know the people in your life instead of accepting other people's narratives about them. He walked away, and that was the last time he saw Melissa Morrison. Thomas threw himself into his business, expanding his portfolio by purchasing 3 new properties in the year following his divorce. He promoted one of his longtime property managers to partner, giving her an equity stake in his management company. He started a non-profit that provided affordable housing for low-income families, using his experience and resources to make a real difference in his community. 2 years after the divorce, Thomas met someone at a real estate investment conference in Seattle. Her name was Andrea Chen. She owned a portfolio of residential properties, and their first conversation was about the challenges of managing difficult tenants. She was sharp, funny, independent, and completely unimpressed by posturing or status games. So you own commercial properties? Andrea asked over coffee after the conference ended. What got you into that versus residential? I like the stability of commercial leases and the business relationships with tenants. What about you? Why residential? I like helping families find good housing. It feels more personal, more impactful, though commercial has better returns, I have to admit. They dated slowly, both of them cautious after previous relationship disappointments. Andrea had been engaged once before to someone who'd tried to take financial advantage of her, and she was wary of people who saw her assets as an opportunity. Thomas had learned the cost of marrying someone who didn't actually know or value who he was. Their relationship developed with careful honesty. They shared financial statements early, discussed their portfolios and goals, were transparent about their pasts and their fears. Andrea knew from the beginning about Thomas's income, his properties, his divorce. Thomas knew about Andrea's business, her savings, her complicated family dynamics. I appreciate that you're straightforward about money, Andrea told Thomas about 6 months into their relationship. My ex used to hide things and it made me feel like I couldn't trust him. You put everything on the table. My ex-wife never asked about money and let her family make assumptions that poisoned our marriage. I learned that honesty up front, even when it's uncomfortable, prevents bigger problems down the road. Did you love her? Andrea asked carefully. Your ex-wife? I did, but I don't think she loved me. She loved the idea of me, the version of me her family was comfortable with. When I turned out to be different than that version, she couldn't reconcile it. I need someone who actually wants to know me, not someone who's comfortable with assumptions. I want to know you, Andrea said simply. The real you, not any edited version. They married 3 years after meeting, in a small ceremony with close friends and no family drama. Thomas's parents attended via video call from Florida, where they'd retired. Andrea's parents came from California, practical people who were more interested in Thomas's character than his bank account. There were no attempts to throw anyone out of anywhere, no assumptions about who owned what, no family members trying to run their lives. This is what partnership looks like, Thomas's business partner said during her toast at the reception. 2 people who know each other, really know each other, all the way down to the tax returns and property deeds. No assumptions, no family interference, no fake versions of themselves. Just 2 successful people building something together with their eyes open. 5 years after his divorce from Melissa, Thomas heard through a mutual acquaintance that Patricia Morrison had passed away after a brief illness. He sent flowers and a sympathy card because it was the decent thing to do, but he felt no particular grief. Patricia had tried to destroy his marriage and throw him out of his own home based on ignorance and entitlement. She'd never apologized, never acknowledged the damage she'd caused, never learned anything from the experience. He heard that Melissa had remarried to an attorney Derek had introduced her to, someone with an impressive title and family money. The wedding had been large and expensive, everything the Morrison family thought Melissa deserved. Thomas hoped it made her happy, but he doubted it. Melissa had never learned to think for herself, to question assumptions, to actually know the people in her life. She'd just found someone who matched her family's definition of acceptable. Thomas and Andrea built a life that was successful by their own definition, financially secure, emotionally honest, free from outside interference. They combined their property portfolios, created an LLC that managed over 40 properties together, and used their success to fund housing initiatives that helped low-income families. They had 2 children, bought a bigger house on the lake, and built something that was theirs, rather than a reflection of family expectations or assumptions. And every time Thomas pulled into the driveway of his house, the house Patricia Morrison had tried to throw him out of, he felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with knowing he'd protected what he'd built and found someone who valued him for who he actually was. The story of Thomas and the Morrison family carries lessons that echo far beyond one failed marriage. First and most importantly, never make assumptions about someone's financial situation based on superficial observations. The Morrison family decided Thomas was unsuccessful because he dressed casually and worked with his hands. They never asked basic questions about his business, his assets, or his income. That willful ignorance cost them credibility and cost Melissa a marriage. We learn that family interference in marriages is toxic, especially when that interference is based on ignorance. Patricia and Derek felt entitled to have opinions about Thomas and to share those opinions constantly with Melissa. But their opinions were based on wrong assumptions, and their interference destroyed a marriage that might otherwise have succeeded. The story teaches us that ownership and legal title matter enormously. Patricia tried to throw Thomas out of what she assumed was Melissa's house without knowing whose name was on the deed. Legal ownership trumps assumptions every single time. Know who actually owns what in your life. We see that financial literacy and curiosity are crucial in marriages. Melissa was married to Thomas for 4 years without knowing basic facts about his income, his assets, or how they afforded their lifestyle. That wasn't Thomas's failure to communicate. He'd tried multiple times. It was Melissa's failure to be curious enough to ask and listen. The story reveals that respect based on wealth, rather than character, is hollow and tells you who someone really is. The Morrison family went from trying to evict Thomas to trying to negotiate a better settlement once they learned he was wealthy. That shift in treatment revealed their values. They respected money, not people. We learn that leaving a marriage based on other people's opinions rather than your own judgment is a catastrophic mistake. Melissa let her family convince her Thomas wasn't good enough without ever independently verifying whether their assessment was accurate. She left her marriage based on their assumptions, and she paid the price. Most importantly, the story shows us that you can't rebuild trust with someone who didn't respect you until they learned your net worth. Thomas knew that Melissa's regret was tied to discovering his wealth, not to understanding who he actually was. That made reconciliation impossible, because the foundation of respect was still about money, not character. The call to action is clear. Ask questions about the important things in your life and relationships. Don't make assumptions about someone's finances, career, or capabilities based on superficial observations. Verify before you judge. Resist family interference in your marriage, especially when that interference is based on ignorance or wrong assumptions. Your spouse deserves your loyalty more than your family deserves their influence. Know who owns what in your marriage and life. Understand legal title, asset ownership, and financial realities. Assumptions about ownership can lead to devastating surprises. Be curious about your spouse's work and life. Ask substantive questions. Look at financial documents. Understand how your lifestyle is funded and who contributes what. Ignorance about your own life is a choice, not a virtue. Judge people by their character and how they treat you, not by your family's opinions or superficial status markers. Your family might be wrong about the people in your life, especially if they're making judgments based on assumptions. Finally, recognize that people who only respect you after discovering your wealth or success were never respecting you in the first place. Real respect is based on character, competence, and how someone lives their values, not on their bank account or asset portfolio. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about assumptions you've made or family interference you've allowed, share it with someone who needs this message. Subscribe to hear more stories about assumptions revealed, family dynamics exposed, and the critical difference between what people think they know and what's actually true. May you ask questions instead of making assumptions. May you protect your marriage from toxic outside interference. May you be curious enough to actually know the people in your life. And may you never try to throw someone out of a house without first checking whose name is on the deed. Remember, when you confidently order someone out of what you assume is your daughter's house, you better make absolutely sure who actually pays the mortgage. Because sometimes the quiet guy your family dismissed as unimpressive owns everything you're standing on, and your assumptions will make you look foolish when reality emerges. Confidence without knowledge is just arrogance waiting to be humbled.